Hi. I want to welcome you all here. Let me start by saying I know it's like church, nobody wants to sit on the front row, but we are going to have an interactive portion after our speaker, and our help here, our gentleman here from the Equity Lab is going to be running around. So if you want to move closer and be a bigger part, it would be great. I don't want to shame anybody, but it's always great to have you a little closer. So if you want to move down, feel welcome to. And on that note, let me welcome you again to Voices for Change, Dismantling Racism, One Policy at a Time. Thank you for coming out in the rain. I am Melissa Kirshner, and I am a member of White Voices Against Racism, which is a nonprofit group that helped put this together. We're very excited to have you all here. I am also a graduate of the UNCG MPA program. In 2008. But it changed my career and my life tremendously, and it was one of the best things I ever did. So there's light at the end of the tunnel, you'll make it, trust me. And it'll be worth every long night and paper you have to write. So this is the beginning of a 4-part series. Obviously tonight's going to be about residential segregation. Tomorrow night we hope you can come back. We hope the weather's a little better. There's going to be a speaker about environmental justice, and then we're going to do sort of the same format. And then we have 2 more events in May. And we would love for you to come to those as well. It's going to be about expanding democracy, various issues there, and then health inequities. And so we would love for you to come to any and all. Again, tomorrow night's event, same time, same place. We want to thank UNCG MPA program for food, space, and all their support. We had sort of what we're calling a social justice bazaar, which was up there earlier. We have books for sale. We have a bookseller here. Ms. Rothstein's book's going to be for sale, and I believe she's going to be signing them after the event. There are some other folks up there, nonprofits, that have information, and we'd love for you to stay and talk with our author and guest speaker and just enjoy being together and talking about the issue. So, let me also recognize our sponsors. I have not been keeping up with this. This is me. And I believe most of you know Hunter Bacott, who will be coming up here in a few minutes. Here's our 4-part series that I just covered. And then we have a lot of sponsors and community partners who have helped us in many different ways. There's no way we could do it without them, and we want to thank them all. And so again, welcome to this event, and what we're going to do now is we're going to look at sort of residential segregation and social justice in 3 parts: learn, engage, and act. So let's start our learn process.
These life experiences have made me a stronger, more critical designer. I've come to understand that design is more than just the objects around us, such as the building we're in or the clothes that we're wearing, but also the ways in which we engage with one another and within the systems in which we live. When I think about systems, I think about our government, education, and even oppression, which is the mistreatment of others at scale. These are all systems that were designed by people. When I shifted my understanding of design from object making to systems building, I began to realize that systems such as discrimination, racism, sexism, and even poverty were designed by people that made intentional choices around exclusion.
I meant to do that.
Thank you, Mark. And he meant to call me too. First of all, my name is Hunter Bacott. I'm the director of the MPA program. I want to welcome everyone here. It's a delight to have you here for this event and these series of events because it's an opportunity to reflect on our community, where it is and where it needs to be and where it needs to go. So thanks for being a part of that. The community is where we live and what we do. And so I really appreciate you being here for that tonight and the subsequent series events. A couple people, before we start, I do want to thank and recognize a couple people, a couple dear to my heart. Mark Kirshner for everything he's done to get this off the ground and going, and Melissa Kirshner, who was right behind him and even in front of him a lot of the times, for conceiving of it and then continuing and persevering even when it didn't look like it was going to go well. So Mark, thank you so much for doing that. The other person I want to recognize is Sue Schwartz for all she does for our community, for our MPA program. She teaches for us, and what she does for the life of baseball. Y'all might not know her, but she's a big baseball fan, and she and I have become friends over the years, and I cherish our friendship and our relationship. So Sue, thank you for this and everything you do. Tonight, I want to introduce, and we're grateful to have this person here with us, is Ms. Leah Rothstein. Ms. Rothstein is the author of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. The book goes in and describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. She also has a regular column, and I suggest you go there on Substack. It's justactionsubstack.com. Those of you who know how to use it, you know what Substack is. That provides current advice and direction on the policies that expand the ideas of Just Action, that review books that are related to Just Action, as well as other community events and activities, and points out new studies, information, and policy developments worth the attention and the read. She has and continues to work on public policy, grassroots organizing, and community change that sees her inspire change in from the neighborhood level to the highest levels of government. Ms. Rothstein, whose policy work is informed by her bachelor's degree with honors in American Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a master's of public policy, almost an administration degree from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, as well as by her years as a community organizer, labor organizer, working on the issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. She has led and continues to be active in the various community efforts ranging from reforming community corrections, consulting with nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance, and to being a labor organizer with the Union of Needle Trades, Industrial, and Textile Employees. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Leah Rothstein, our own contemporary Mother Jones, to UNCG and our beautiful Emerald City in Greensboro.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Hunter, Mark, Melissa. Thank you all for being here and braving that crazy rain out there. So as you might have guessed, I'll be talking about residential segregation, a bit about how we came to be a racially segregated country, and then I'll get into some of what we can do to challenge and remedy that today. So I'm going to start by talking about this idea that we've sort of come to accept as a country about why we're segregated in our neighborhoods, why our neighborhoods are segregated. All over the country, every metropolitan area, segregation is sort of the way things are, in particular the segregation of African Americans and whites in separate neighborhoods. So we tell ourselves that this is a form of what's called de facto segregation. It's not caused by laws or government policies. That would be de jure segregation, but de facto segregation is something different. This is what we've told ourselves, that it's, it was caused, spurred, created by private actors, maybe bigoted realtors or landlords who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or that we're segregated because it's just sort of a matter of personal preference, that we like to live around people who look like us, and so we kind of self-select, and it's just kind of a naturally occurring phenomenon that we live in segregated neighborhoods. When we look around, many of us look around the country and look at our neighborhoods and we think it's too bad that we're so separated and so segregated, but there's not much we can do about it, because when we think of it as happening by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. We don't have any agency to do anything about it. This idea is so prevalent, it's reached up to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because The government had no role to play in creating segregation. It has no role to play in challenging or undoing it. So very pervasive belief we've adopted. Now, in that context, my father, Richard Rothstein, in 2017 wrote the book, The Color of Law. And the whole premise of that book was challenging taking on this idea of de facto segregation and concluding that it's an utter myth. That, sure, there were private actors that helped create segregation, those landlords and realtors, but their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by the federal government and state and local governments to ensure that blacks and whites lived apart from each other. And these actions of the government that created segregation and sustained it, they're as unconstitutional as the laws here in the South that segregated lunch counters in schools and buses, as much a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution as those laws. And as such, once we reckon with that true history, the subtitle of his book, The Color of Law, was A Forgotten History of How the Government Segregated America. It was a history that wasn't hidden when it happened, but we've since forgotten it. And when we remember, when we come to reckon with the true history of how we came to be segregated, we can see that we have an obligation to do something about it. Because when our government, violates the Constitution, we have an obligation to remedy those actions and those violations. But so far, no one's really stepped up to remedy this nationwide issue of segregation and housing discrimination. So I'll give one example from the history, from The Color of Law, that is one of many, many examples of a government policy that created and maintained segregated communities. So this example comes from after World War II. When millions of war veterans came home from the war, they started families, there was a baby boom. They were met with a housing shortage because very little housing was built during the war and little housing was built prior to World War II and the Great Depression, so there weren't enough houses for all of these growing families. The federal government wanted to step in and help meet that demand for housing. So it did that by suburbanizing the country. We weren't a suburban economy at the time. Most people lived near urban centers because they worked in factories or businesses that supported those factories. Those factories had to be near rail lines and ports, so they were, concentrated in urban areas. But the federal government, in meeting this demand for housing, decided to change the landscape of how we lived in this country by helping to create suburbs and ensuring that those suburban communities were open only to white families and white households. So one example of this, a famous example maybe you've heard of, is Levittown outside of New York City. Levittown was built by a developer named William Levitt. He wanted to build 17,000 homes in Long Island, outside of New York City, where people didn't live at the time. And he didn't have the money. 17,000 homes is a lot of money, or to be able to build 17,000 homes requires a lot of money, and he didn't have it. He couldn't get a bank loan, a regular bank loan, to do that because it was very speculative. People didn't live there yet. He didn't have, there was no community around there. He didn't have buyers lined up. So the only way he could finance building Levittown was through a federally backed loan guarantee from the federal government, through the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. And the FHA gave this kind of loan guarantee to Levitt and builders like him all over the country on the condition that they ensured that they would never sell a home in their community to anyone but a white home buyer. So the FHA, this was not a hidden government policy. This wasn't, a few people in the FHA that were advancing this idea. This was written in the FHA manual. And builders, developers like William Levitt, who got an FHA-backed loan, they had to write in the deeds of the homes that they created what's called a restrictive covenant. It says that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by a white family, a white household. So this was, just one piece of the way the federal government, the FHA, created these whites-only suburbs. In the federal manual, it said that even, the federal government would only finance suburbs for white families, but would only finance those suburbs if they were located nowhere near where African Americans lived. They had to be far apart, or the builder was required to build a wall between the two communities. This was written in the FHA manual. This was not, a hidden policy. This wasn't an accident. This de facto idea, this idea that it's just sort of a natural occurrence, is obviously nonsense. There's evidence and example after example in the color of law of policies like this that explicitly ensured that we created separate communities for blacks and whites all over the country. So William Levitt himself, he was a bigot. It wasn't hidden either. He said at the time that if he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't sell his homes to African-American households or families. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. So if you can reimagine an alternate history where the federal government told William Levitt, we'll give you this loan guarantee if you promise to sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, things would look very different all over the country today. So today, Levittown is 2% African American in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. And that disparity is due to the policies that were set in place when those homes were created. And I'll explain a little more about why that is, why it's still persistent, because that kind of discrimination is no longer legal, but it has long-term repercussions. So when Levittown was built, the homes in that community cost about $100,000 in today's money. That's pretty affordable for a working family. I'm from California. You can't buy a house for $100,000 anywhere near where I live. So that was a pretty affordable price. It was because it was financed, backed by the federal government, and these white families could get FHA mortgages. If they were veterans, they could get Veterans Administration mortgages with low interest rates, no down payment requirements. They were subsidized on both ends to be affordable homes. Now, homes in those communities no longer cost $100,000. They cost $3, $4, $5. In Levittown, $600,000 is the median home price. So those white families who got into home ownership in those suburban communities when it was affordable, they didn't do it to get rich or to build wealth. They needed a home. But what happened is they did build wealth. So as those homes, accumulated in value from $100,000 to $600,000, those families accumulated wealth that they could then use, for whatever they wanted, to send their kids to college, to enjoy their retirements, and most importantly, to hand down wealth to their children and grandchildren to buy their own homes. So that is one reason, the main reason we have such a huge wealth gap between African Americans and whites in this country today. We have an income gap that is concerning and the subject of another talk about income policies and wage-related policies, but average African American household income is about 60% of average white household income. And you would think that the wealth gap would be about the same ratio because two families that make about the same amount of money can save about the same amount of money. But the wealth gap is way larger than that 60%. Average African American household wealth is about 5% of average white household wealth. That's a huge disparity. And it's due primarily to these policies that helped and subsidized white families to build this intergenerational wealth that just keeps building and accumulating and compounding over the generations, and explicitly prohibiting African Americans from participating in that wealth building experience of owning a home. So we now have, the Fair Housing Act. It was passed in 1968. Discrimination on the basis of race in the sale of and rental of housing is no longer legal. But it's somewhat of an empty promise when you look at places like Levittown to say, look, anybody can buy in this community, when certain families, white families, are more likely to have the cash needed, the intergenerational, wealth and inheritance for a down payment, and African American families are far less likely to have that. So that's why we see the disparities that exist in suburbs today between how many African American families can live in Levittown today versus how many live in the surrounding areas. This is why the impacts and the consequences of segregation are so long lasting. So the wealth gap is one of those consequences of the policies that created segregation, and there's many more. The segregation of our neighborhoods underlie most of our serious social problems and biggest racial disparities in this country. A child who grows up in a segregated African American community or neighborhood is more likely to live near a freeway with trucks that spew pollution, or more likely to live near industry that spews pollution into the air, more likely to live in a building that has old paint and exposure to lead paint. So those children grow up to have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and shorter life expectancies than white children who grow up in white neighborhoods. So when we talk about segregation, this isn't, an issue of the past. It's not something that is over and done with, and it's not something that doesn't matter. It actually has the biggest impacts, not only on our quality of life, but how long we live. So it's not something we can ignore, and in fact, as my dad argued in The Color of Law, we have an obligation to not ignore it and to do something about it. So, a lot of people read The Color of Law. It came along at a time when there was a lot of interest in learning about this history. A lot of people have read it. And as a result, there's somewhat, the less currency for the de facto segregation idea around the country. We talk about redlining a lot more easily than we did before that book came out. We have, some more growing understanding of how we came to be so segregated and, what the consequences of that segregation are. But it doesn't mean we know what to do about it, right? We might understand we have an obligation to do something, but it doesn't tell us what we can do. When my dad asked me to help him write this book, I'm one of the people who came up to him after hearing him talk about The Color of Law and said, it's really important that we're remembering this history, but what do we do about it now? Trump had just been elected. It didn't feel like there was much that could be done. And I've worked, as a community organizer, I've worked in housing policy. I still didn't see how we could change this overwhelming, seemingly intractable problem. So he challenged me to help him figure it out. We wrote this book to show that there's actually a lot that we can do. It might feel impossible, it might feel overwhelming, but there are so many things that we can do on a local level that can have big impacts to challenging and remedying the impacts or the consequences of segregation. So what we argue in Just Action is that to live up to our obligation to remedy segregation, we need a newly activated civil rights movement all around the country, made up of groups in local communities that are educated about the history, how we came to be here in this segregated society, and educated about what we can do next, and activated to advocate for change in their own communities. Now, it might seem like we're on our way to building that new civil rights movement, or it might have seemed like that a little more a couple years ago. But in 2020, we had a huge racial reckoning in this country where 20 million people turned out for Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They were, black and white, young and old, from urban and suburban communities. More people than had turned out for racial justice demonstrations than ever before. It seemed like things were going to change. And, what happened after that? Well, people went home dealing with the pandemic and other challenges. They put maybe a lawn sign on their front lawn. They maybe started a book club to read books about this issue, or they went back to their companies and hired DEI officers, or issued letters to their shareholders, denouncing racism and promising to do better. All of these things are important for raising awareness and sort of advancing the conversation around the country, but alone, a lawn sign, a book club, a letter to shareholders, it doesn't do anything to change, the structure, the way our communities are made up. One of the reasons why then go on to take on and challenge segregation is because, of not really knowing how to do that and not knowing what levers we have in our own communities to affect. So we argue that to build this national activated civil rights movement, we need to start by building local groups in our own communities that are biracial and multi-ethnic. We need leadership that's both Black and white, and membership that's, all ethnicities and races. And we understand that this is daunting. We live in very segregated communities, so we don't necessarily have natural social contact with people of other races outside of the workplace. Going about our day-to-day lives in our neighborhoods, dropping the kids off at school, or going to the grocery store, we tend to see people who look like us. So in order to build these relationships that are necessary to build the committees that can then take on these issues, we have to take some intentional steps to cross these boundaries and to build social relationships. And so we start the book by giving some examples that have done that. I have a lot to get through, so say, but these communities that have brought people together from segregated parts of town to build relationships and learn that they're actually not that different from each other. They might live in different looking communities, but personally they have the same hopes and dreams and aspirations, and they can start to break down those barriers and then question why their communities look so different and then start to do something about it. So that's an essential first step. And then once these groups are formed, what we advocate is that they need to start by focusing on local policy. Because even though, we're going to need massive federal policy change, massive federal interventions and investments to change segregation on the national level, we don't have that kind of political will on the national level to do much right now, let alone take on this issue. But we can build that political will locally. And I've been traveling around the country talking to groups like this everywhere, and there are groups forming and activating and making change on the local level everywhere in all types of communities. And that is a really hopeful piece of this story. I hope it comes across that this is happening everywhere. And even though the federal government, had a large role to play in creating segregation, once that segregation is created, to a large extent, it's maintained by local policy. So there's actually a lot we can do locally to challenge segregation, to sort of shift the tide on it, and then to remedy its impacts as well. And I'll get into a couple examples of that in a moment. So in Just Action, this is sort of the context. We need to build this movement. We need to build local committees. We need to build relationships across races. And then we describe dozens of strategies and policies that these local groups can take on in their own community. Policies and strategies we describe, there's dozens of them in the book, and for each one we give an example of a community that's successfully working on that issue. Recently, most are very recent stories, just to show again that there's a lot of movement on this and it's not impossible to enact these changes. So the strategies and policies we talk about, they do two things. Most don't do them both at the same time, but together they do both of these things. They need to look to the future to ensure that we don't continue to maintain and perpetuate segregation in the policies we have that help create and help our communities grow. And then we need to also look to the past, because we need to remedy the consequences of segregation if we're truly to redress its harms. So like the wealth gap I mentioned before, we can't sort of create an equitable, desegregated society if we don't address that disparity. And so there's strategies and policies for addressing the disparities that exist as a result of segregation, as well as looking to the future. So then the strategies we describe, they sort of fit into two main categories. The first category is those strategies and policies that are concerned with increasing investment in lower income segregated, predominantly African American communities, where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of government-sponsored segregation and government policies. Because again, when the government created segregation, it didn't create equal communities in that segregation. It provided resources and opportunities to communities where whites were allowed to live, and took resources away and denied resources to the communities where African Americans were limited to living in. So to redress the harms of those policies, we want to make those communities areas of higher opportunity, of more access to opportunity, to jobs, to clean air, grocery stores, banks, transportation, high quality schools. And we understand that when that happens in a lower income community, when you increase investments in those communities, often what happens is suddenly people with higher incomes become interested in moving into those communities. They move in, they drive up the housing costs. We call this gentrification, and often a lot of the longtime residents of those areas are displaced. And so these, these strategies to increase investments in these areas need to be coupled with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur when investments increase in these lower income areas. So some of those kinds of anti-displacement strategies are, policies that control how fast rents can rise, to protect renters from rapidly increasing rents, to protect renters from unjust evictions, to provide renters with free legal counsel when they're facing an eviction, because often when gentrification occurs, landlords find reasons or they jack up rents to get their lower paying tenants out so they can bring in higher paying tenants. So one way to prevent some of that displacement is to provide more protections for the renters in those areas. We can also pass ordinances called inclusionary zoning ordinances, which require that they're passed through the planning codes in a local jurisdiction, and it requires that when new housing is built in an area, that a certain percentage of the units in that new development have to be preserved and reserved as affordable to lower and moderate income households. So that's a way where in gentrifying communities, there's often a lot of new market rate housing being built. It's a way of ensuring that at least some of the new housing built can be affordable to the longtime residents of those communities. Now, we advocate for going a step further and ensuring that those affordable units go to the longtime residents of those communities who are at risk of displacement. So priorities, preferences on those units, or what's called affirmative marketing to ensure that the people who are being priced out of that community sort of know about the opportunities to access those affordable units. Another strategy for preventing displacement, creating affordable housing opportunities in gentrifying communities is starting or expanding a community land trust. So have people heard of land trusts? Yep, okay, some. So a land trust is a nonprofit organization. There's over 300 communities around the country that have a land trust. They're growing rapidly right now, getting a lot of attention, which is great. It's a great model for creating permanently affordable home ownership opportunities in areas where housing prices are rising and preventing displacement that can occur with gentrification. And I'll explain how they do that by explaining the example we write about in Just Action of a land trust is from Durham. So the Durham Community Land Trust, it was started in the 80s, I believe. A group of residents of a predominantly African-American lower income neighborhood near Duke University. They started by just going door to door to their neighbors and asking, what can we do to make our neighborhood better? The first thing that people talked about wanting was to turn a vacant lot in their neighborhood into a park, because there was no park in their neighborhood and kids were playing in the street. Some had been hit by cars. And so they were concerned and they wanted the city to build a park. And so they started organizing around that, and they won. They got the park, and that got the group excited, looked around what else could they do to improve conditions in their area. Their neighborhood was gentrifying at the time because Duke was expanding, and so investors saw an opportunity to buy up the homes in that area to sell and rent to Duke students and faculty. So this group decided, they learned about the land trust model, and they decided to start one to try to prevent some of that displacement and hold on to some of the homes in their area. So they started by the city donating 2 vacant homes to the land trust. They fixed them up and they sold them at affordable prices, about $100,000 in today's money. They sold those first homes for. And what happens when a land trust sells a home is the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house and sells just the home to the homeowner. And the homeowner, pays a small amount a year to lease the land from the land trust. And because the rising cost of land is one of the main reasons housing costs rise so quickly, when you take land out of the equation, the house is more affordable. And so the homeowner then owns the home like any other homeowner. They pay their taxes and insurance and mortgage. And when they want to sell that home, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes. And every land trust establishes it slightly differently, but they try to meet 2 goals. And one is to allow the home sellers to accumulate some equity in the sale of the home. It's not as much as if they sold it on market for the market value, but some equity, and it's limited because the other competing goal is to ensure that the home price is affordable to the next home buying family. So that's how land trusts can create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities, which is really hard to do any other way. So it's a great model for doing that. So the Durham Land Trust, it now has over 300 properties all around Durham, has many rental properties and some for sale properties. And their for sale homes now sell for $150,000. So we can see how that, they're slightly less affordable than they were when they started, but the surrounding homes in that neighborhood sell for $500,000. So they've retained a lot of affordability in their portfolio of homes. And they've also prevented a lot of displacement. So in the neighborhood where they started and operate most commonly in, most of the residents on the blocks where the land trust acquired homes are still African American, while the blocks where investors outpace the land trust mostly have completely gentrified and most of the residents are white. So it's a great example for, creating these permanently affordable homeownership opportunities, preventing displacement in gentrifying areas. And, what can we do about it? Well, I was looking into what's happening here as I was preparing for this talk, and there is a land trust being formed as we speak here in Greensboro that the city is taking the lead on forming. So that, I believe, what I've read is that by the end of April, it should be, I think that's the goal for having it up and running. So if you want, a group here to be involved in solutions and challenging segregation and creating a land trust, you can get involved and call your city council person and make sure that they, enact this land trust and get it going. And then once it's started, can support it individually and collectively by volunteering or, helping ensure that the land trust has the resources it needs to expand and to acquire property. There's ways people can, deed their homes and their wills to land trusts, for example. That's a way to help the land trust increase its portfolio. But most importantly, aside from what we can do individually, is always what we can do collectively. And that is, pressuring and advocating that the local government start this land trust and then continue to support it by giving over vacant properties as much as it can to the land trust to expand its portfolio. And then we can also look beyond local government and look to the local institutions and corporations in our communities to help to expand the reach of land trusts. So I mentioned earlier the restrictive covenants that the federal government required, developers in the mid-20th century to put on their homes that said that the homes could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Those covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deeds of homes forever. They're part of the legal documentation of those homes. So a lot of communities have started researching those covenants and inventorying them to see where they exist and how widespread they are. Well, another piece of that is you can look on the homes that have these restrictive covenants, on those deeds, on most house deeds, it lists the companies that were involved in creating the home when it was first built. So the bank that first financed it, the builder and developer that built it, the realtor that sold it for the first time. So in many times, those companies are still operating in our communities. We looked into some of these examples in Charlottesville, Virginia. Those 4 entities, the bank, builder, developer, and realtor, they were all still operating, the ones named on the restrictive covenants in Charlottesville, or had been acquired by companies that are operating in Charlottesville today. So a group organized around the redress of segregation could then go to those companies and say, look, you helped to create this segregation, you have an obligation to do something to remedy that. And one of the ways it can do that is by donating land or resources to a land trust. So that's one way you can provide to these corporations as a path forward. Many of them, in 2020 put, these 4 entities in Charlottesville that we researched put statements on their websites, denouncing racism and promising to be part of the solution. So this is one way that they can do that. But they won't do that unless people are pressuring them. Local organized groups are working on these issues. Okay, so that's one category of strategies, the ones concerned with increasing investments in lower income communities and preventing displacement. The other category of strategies we talk about are called mobility strategies, and they're concerned with opening up exclusive, usually expensive, usually predominantly white suburban communities to more diverse residents. So these are 2 prongs. We have to do both of these things to truly challenge segregation. There's a lot of ways we can do this. We can change zoning to allow a more diverse housing type to be built in these suburban communities. Many suburban communities only allow 1 house to be built per lot. That ensures that the home prices stay very high. And this type of zoning actually came to prominence when racialized zoning was deemed unconstitutional. Cities used to zone their residential areas by race. The Supreme Court said that they couldn't do that in the early 1900s, so they adopted single-family only zoning to say, okay, well then we'll just make sure house prices are very expensive so that only whites can afford to live here. And that has persisted, and that's part of the reason why many suburban communities are still almost exclusively white, and why we are in a nationwide housing crisis, because we don't have enough homes all around the country. So changing zoning is an essential first step. Also providing subsidies to African Americans to live in communities where they've previously been prohibited from living, rental subsidies, home ownership subsidies, and inclusionary zoning policies also work in these types of communities, again, ensuring that there's some less expensive housing units being built when new housing developments occur. Another strategy I'll go into a little more detail on has to do with the Section 8 program. So the Section 8 program is, or the Housing Choice Voucher program, it's a rental subsidy. It's the largest rental subsidy program in the country. It is funded by the federal government through the Housing and Urban Development Department, HUD, and administered by local public housing authorities. Over 2 million low-income households, disproportionately African-American households, receive Section 8 housing vouchers. That's a quarter of the households that are eligible, or a quarter, a year or two ago when I researched these numbers, there's probably even more eligible today. But the funding isn't increased. That's a federal policy issue. But there's still 2 million households that receive Section 8 vouchers. And what happens when you receive a Section 8 voucher is you get a benefit that's mobile. So instead of when you are a public housing recipient and your benefit is tied to a unit, when you have a Section 8 voucher, you can use that voucher presumably to rent anywhere in the jurisdiction of your housing authority. So when the Section 8 program was started, it was started with the intent, the promise, the potential to expand the opportunity of low-income families to leave high poverty areas, to move into what are called high opportunity areas. We all want to live in high opportunity communities, places with well-resourced public schools and clean air and access to open space and low crime. And the Section 8 program had the potential to provide the opportunity for low-income families to live in these areas because they're often, too expensive for low-income families to afford on their own. But only 5% of Section 8 families can use their voucher to rent in high-opportunity neighborhoods. That's a very small proportion of those 2 million. White Section 8 recipients are more likely to live in high opportunity areas than African Americans. So it's not living up to its potential. It's far from living up to its potential to provide this opportunity to low-income families. One main reason for that is because discrimination against tenants who use Section 8 to help pay their rent is legal on the federal level. The federal government has not made that a protected class. So landlords, according to the federal government, can say, just no Section 8, I won't rent to you if that's how you pay your rent. Now there's a lot of, about 20 states and 100 cities and counties that have passed what are called source of income discrimination ordinances that make that kind of discrimination illegal. Greensboro does not have a source of income discrimination ordinance. There are some cities and counties in North Carolina that do, but they're very limited. They only apply to developments that receive public money. So only, multifamily buildings that are financed with public funds are required to not discriminate. Anyone else can discriminate. And it sort of gets worse than that. There's a bill that's been introduced in the state legislature here that would make it illegal for local governments to pass a source of income discrimination law at all. So it would join 2 other states. If this passes, it would join 2 other states that preempt localities from outlawing this kind of discrimination. So I know I see looks of disappointment and disgust, as you should feel, but it's also an opportunity, right? Call your state senators and advocate that they don't pass this bill. It's HB 551, and I believe it's passed the House and it's at the Senate now. So this is a great, opportunity for advocacy and for action to help make sure that that doesn't pass, so that then there's actually a possibility of being able to pass a source of income discrimination ordinance here. Even without that ordinance, though, there's still, actions we can take to help ensure that Section 8 tenants aren't being discriminated against. Oftentimes, discrimination against someone for using Section 8 is a cover for racial discrimination. Racial discrimination is illegal. Discrimination against someone who uses Section 8 is not. So sometimes landlords will tell African American potential tenants, sorry, we don't take Section 8, but they will accept white Section 8 tenants. That is illegal when it's used as a cover for racial discrimination. Now, the only way we can know when this is happening is by sending what's called paired testers out to pose as potential tenants to units that are listed as for rent. And the testers are sometimes volunteers, sometimes paid a small stipend by a local fair housing organization or a local civil rights organization. And you show up, you have similar qualifications, different races, show up separately. You act like you're wanting to rent the unit and see how you're treated. And if the African American potential tenant who says they use Section 8 is told, sorry, we don't rent to Section 8 tenants, but the white tester who says they use Section 8 is offered the unit or shown the unit, that's clear evidence of discrimination. And that's really the only way we can find where discrimination is occurring. And this work is left to fair housing organizations. And those organizations need our support resource-wise. They are underfunded. They don't have enough funds to do enough of this testing to begin with. But then they also need our support, as testers. So this is a way we can be involved in solutions by volunteering to be testers to help tease out where discrimination is occurring so that it can then be prosecuted and what discrimination laws are on the books can be enforced. So that's one piece of the Section 8 puzzle. The other obstacle that makes Section 8 less of less of living up to its potential to provide opportunities to live in high opportunity areas is the voucher amount itself. So how the Section 8 program works, when you receive a voucher, you pay 30% of your monthly income towards your rent, no matter what your income is, and the voucher makes up the difference, up to a maximum amount that's set based on the metropolitan area where you live, and it's set based on the full span of rents in that metropolitan area, so the lowest to the highest, and you take the middle rent, and 10% below that middle rent is the maximum rent a voucher will pay. So if you think about that, 60% of the rents in the whole metropolitan area are out of reach of voucher holders because that's more than the maximum. They can't afford it. So it's not surprising that voucher holders can't find units in higher cost areas, higher opportunity areas, because the voucher just won't pay enough. So this has been an issue for a long time. There was a lawsuit about this in 2010 in Dallas, and some changes started in first 24 metropolitan areas. Starting next year, 65 metropolitan areas will be required to change this standard to, instead of calculating the maximum voucher amount based on the middle rent of the whole metro area, it takes smaller areas. So a zip code or a group of zip codes, the middle rent in that small area is how much a voucher will pay in that zip code. So in higher cost areas of a metro region, a voucher will pay more than in lower cost areas, which makes a lot of sense. Seems like it should have been that way the whole time, but at least it's starting to catch on and be required in more places. So starting in 2025, this metro area will be required to use that small area fair market rent standard. That's what it's called. And this is one of the 65 areas that's soon to be required to use this. So that's great news, and it can have a big impact in voucher holders here having the ability to move to higher cost areas. But again, it will take local residents being involved and informed and working with the local housing authority to make sure that they're implementing that faithfully. And then ensuring that landlords in those areas are willing to rent to Section 8 tenants. And we can do that by talking to people we know who are landlords, by helping dispel some of the myths that exist out there about renting to Section 8 tenants, and just sort of helping move that along and create more opportunities in these higher cost areas. So that's an important piece of the sort of mobility puzzle, and one example, a strategy, something we can do in our local communities around that. So really quickly, one more example of an issue we can take on locally. It is one that spans all kinds of communities, low income segregated communities, higher income segregated communities. And these are strategies that have to do with increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in any community. So there's lots of ways African Americans are disadvantaged in the home buying process compared to whites. One is the wealth gap I've talked about. having less access to wealth means you're less likely to be able to bid high enough to get the home or have enough to pay for the down payment to buy a home in today's market. But there's other ways that are sort of less obvious that also present obstacles to African Americans to buying homes. And one is the credit scoring system. So the credit scoring system, national system, run by 3 credit scoring agencies mostly. And it is, we think of it as an objective rating of our future likelihood of repaying a debt. It's based on your financial history, so if you've defaulted on loans in the past, you'll have a lower credit score, which makes some kind of sense. And if you have a high enough credit score, you'll be eligible for a mortgage, and if it's even high enough, you can get a lower interest rate. So the credit score really matters. If you have too low of a credit score or no credit score, you can't get a mortgage at all. Now, it makes some kind of sense. It takes into your financial history and spits out a credit score, these systems. But the problem is that it only takes into account a certain type of financial history. And it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. So if you live in a community which, more likely, segregated African American communities are less likely to have access to bank branches. They're less likely to be located in those communities. So you have less access to traditional financial tools like credit cards and bank accounts in your neighborhood. So you might be more likely to use a payday lender when you need a loan, because those are located in your community. And if you get a payday lender loan and you pay it back, even with the exorbitant interest rates, you pay it back on time and in full, it seems like a good indication of your financial history and your ability to repay a loan. But those non-traditional financial instruments aren't factored into a credit score. So through no fault of your own, you live in a community where you can't access traditional financial instruments, so you are less likely to have the kind of financial history that factors into a credit score. Similarly, if you've owned a home in the past and you've paid a mortgage, that is automatically fed into the credit scoring system, your mortgage payment history. But if you've been a renter your whole life and paid your rent on time, never missed a rent payment, never missed a utility bill payment, that financial history is not factored into a credit score. So the result is this is an example of a policy, a program that is racially neutral on its face. It doesn't have a racially discriminatory intent, but it has a racially discriminatory impact. And that's just as damaging and just as concerning, and we have as much of an obligation to remedy that as we do things that have racially discriminatory intents. So one way we can do that is ensuring that credit scores factor rental payment history into their algorithms. This is something that's starting to happen on the national level. There's some pilot programs starting where renters can opt in to have their their rental payment history reported to the credit scoring agencies. It's just sort of starting. It's been the result of 15 years of conversations on the federal level to get those changes that are just starting. So again, if we wait for federal change on these issues, we'll be waiting, a long time, another 15 years maybe. In that amount of time, we can work with our local banks and credit unions and financial institutions to start to factor in rental payment history in their own credit scoring algorithms and their own bank branches. And many have started to do this. There's, companies springing up that help provide the rental payment history to financial institutions to help make this easier. So banks can do this. We write about some in Just Action that have, but they often won't do it unless there's, local residents in their communities advocating that they change their credit scoring algorithms to count rental payment history. And doing that goes a long way towards opening up mortgage access, credit access to African Americans, and that's an important piece of the closing the home ownership gap between blacks and whites. So again, there's a lot we can do on the local level around these issues, and I gave some examples just to show that there's a lot of pieces that go into maintaining segregation, and it might be overwhelming, but there's just as many pieces that go into taking it apart and to challenging it. And I get often a lot of questions about but what's the one thing? What's the one thing we should be doing that will have the biggest impact, that will solve it all? And there isn't one thing, there's many, many things. So the one thing that's the most important thing is anything. Just to start working on these issues in your own community, start to enact it and advocate for change, and together those small pieces will then start to unravel the system and challenge and remedy it. And that's the only way we can move forward and get started. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll continue to talk about it for a bit.
Leah, as well as Sue. I'm going to start this video to transition us from learn to engage.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not two nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So, notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So, over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that at TED. Thanks.
You're expecting us to dance back to
Thanks to Derek. So, let's say we're transitioning into engage and invite up Orpheus Williams with the Equity Lab to lead that facilitation. And let me take a moment to say Sue Schwartz is the planning director for the city of Greensboro. She has also been a force in the planning profession, both here in the state and nationally, and she is the new president-elect of the American Planning Association. She preceded me at UNC, what was UNCC at that time, so we're both geographers from the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences, I believe is what they refer to it as.
Without geography, you are nowhere. Just
the other thing I always like to say when I introduce Sue or speak of her is I live in her neighborhood. not near her, but she was the lead planner that helped develop South Side, which is a community, I say in downtown. We say we live in downtown. It is a model community for diversity, not only of housing types, but of people as well. And it's really a shame, Sue, that it hasn't caught on, but maybe it will. So Orpheus, turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Leah, does that make you the first nut and we all witnessing the
Maybe. Sure, I'll take it.
So first off, I promise we're going to get to a Q&A, but a little bit about what the Engage role is right now. Orpheus Williams, coming from the Equity Lab, we do lots of liberatory and anti-racist conversations across the country with different organizations. And in setups like these, often the speakers don't get a chance to hear how you're processing what was just shared before we jump to questions. And just a quick note of just a personal connection, Leah and I had a chance to interact a little bit before, and we talked about reactions that folks have. And among that spectrum, one of the reactions that Leah shared that happens with these talks is people saying, well, you basically narrated my life, okay? And during that whole conversation, I'm furiously taking notes. I'm like, I was the Section 8 kid. I'm coming from Brooklyn, New York. All of the examples that you talked about were basically K to 12 for me. And then I'd say K to 8. And then in high school, I moved to Long Island and played against the students from Levittown. And saw the complete difference and didn't understand once the game was over, our butts need to get on the bus and we need to go. So it's a very deep personal connection, but also the idea of enlightening all across the country about the possibilities and being able to talk across lines of difference. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you, I wasn't going to ask you to move, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to ask you to partner up, and this is why. Early on, Antoinette talked about how we engage. That was the first video. And Leah talked about creating a newly activated civil rights movement and breaking down the walls between us. Part of this engagement is first break down the walls between speakers and you all. The second part, and probably most important, are those individual conversations that need to happen that aren't happening at different levels. So what I want you to do with a partner, whether you know them or not, whether they're close to you or not, first you're just going to talk about the impressions that you had from the talk. What came up for you, what was surprising, what was a confirmation, what possibly you want to challenge. Second, you'll get to, well, what questions do you have for both Sue and Leah at the panel? But immediately important is for you all to start to break down the walls between each other and just talk from the heart. What was that experience like? What was it like hearing those things? I'll bring you back. I was an educator for 30 years. I'll bring you back with a countdown or a ding or something, right? But I'll bring you back, and the first thing you'll share before the questions will be your impressions. And we'll bounce around a little bit, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Does that work? Sounds good. Yeah. All right. Find a partner. I'll give you a signal when we're coming back together. Any volunteers to get us started?
I don't know. It was interesting about the political distribution and the ways that it's shaped America. That's really all I have to say for that. And then I guess my question is.
Don't press it right now. Just around the room.
I mean, it felt nice, I guess, just listening to somebody talk about the way that things have been or have shaped themselves to this point. And in some ways, like the links to the inherently broken foundation that America has been, built upon. And, the whole idea of educating ourselves as a public, because, the public has the power, and through education we can become, in some ways, more qualified to change the distribution of political power.
Go for it.
I've been involved in the last month in another seminar given by the Cherokee in Cherokee. And my impression this evening with the description that we both were most moved by is just more evidence to me that what we really need is the truth to be told. And we're not telling the truth of our history in this country. And until we do, we're going to hear things like you told us about the federal government having a major hand in how to keep people separated. We will be shocked, but we haven't heard the truth overall. It's not taught, and we know it isn't, even in these higher institutions. So that is something to me that I feel we can't make appropriate decisions without knowing the truth. And we really need to know the whole truth. That's what my impression.
Good evening. Thank you so much for talking with us tonight. My friend Terry and I were just talking about taking it from the macro comments that we've just heard to a very micro comment for me. I live in a neighborhood here in Greensboro, which is very much a post-war neighborhood designed, built for GIs returning from World War II. And so immediately I started thinking about restrictive covenants. And my new friend Terry here has researched them thoroughly, and she informed me that my neighborhood has tons of restrictive covenants hidden in the deeds. And so we are gonna grab lunch or have a coffee date to do a deeper dive on that. So just very impactful immediately right out the gate in my own life.
This is just a very brief comment, but the discussions that we had, we're all three practitioners in the planning department and sort of actively involved in local government. And if it's our job to help redress these issues, I think it's really surprising that each of us found something that we learned as experts. So I just thought that was interesting.
What often happens with the impression sharing, and we're going to start with our first question, is even at the door, when you see someone that you don't know, based on their package, we make assumptions about what they believe, just how they present. This sort of exercise is the first step in cracking the assumption and getting to the actual human being that you're sitting near, next to, behind, or in front of. Their beliefs may align way more deeply than you think, or you may see an opportunity to provide new information in a way that you didn't think about before. So I encourage you to use this in your spaces as well, just as a way for including both introverts and extroverts in the conversation. First question.
I have two questions. My first question is, education as a form of building political accountability through the subscription of a collective conscience, it kind of fundamentally challenges what America is built upon, which is at some levels ignorance and the exploitation of labor. So do you envision us like tearing down everything that America has, built up to this point in order to get this change? And my second question is the arena just too big at this point? You talk about education through localizing and socialization, but it feels like these cities that we live in now are just too vast and too big of an arena for us to invest in localization as our first most form of interaction and theorization.
I'm going to take a shot at education. So Leah's father's book, The Color of Law, I've been a planner for over 40 years. When that book came out in 2017, I read a couple chapters of it, but I had to read, because I teach for a nonprofit called Neighborhoods America, and there were some interesting things to it. When we had the Black Lives Matter and the riots here in Greensboro, pervaded here in Greensboro in 2020. We had riots in Greensboro. Greensboro is not a riot place. I mean, this is just, it was shocking in downtown and went throughout. Our city manager at the time asked the department heads to put together a plan. How are we going to talk about what's going on in our community? Because we can't just come in and, collect taxes or, process rezoning requests and just not acknowledge what's happening here in Greensboro. So what I did with one of the things we did with my department is my friends at the library helped me organize a mini book club approach of the senior division managers reading The Color of Law together. We read it together and then talked about it. The point was to then apply what it means in Greensboro. It broke our hearts. It broke because we love our profession. We love what we do. We love the potential we can do for our community. And to know that one of the fundamental tools that we use to regulate land for public health, safety, and general welfare was used as a racist tool initially, whites only zoning. I will tell you, I was not taught that in planning school. In my planning classes, we started zoning from 1926, Euclid versus Amber Realty, and there was a whole 50, 70 years prior to that. So the education piece is something you keep doing. Since that time, every chance I get, I weave it in my presentations. Whether I was talking to the commercial realtors yesterday, I was talking to the estate attorneys last week, and I weave in, we talk about growth in Greensboro, and there's lots of things to celebrate. I weave in, but we have to overcome some of our history. And I weave in the redlining map of Greensboro, and I start talking through some of the insidious things that occurred that are still in place. It's still hard to get a loan for a mixture of uses. You can only get a single family development for single family homes. You can't get it for apartments. I may be just one voice, but I'm one of many voices. People hear me and repeat it. There are some people here tonight that heard me speak yesterday and chose to come. So it takes a ripple, it takes a pebble. It's not insurmountable. And you kept saying arena. My favorite quote on leadership is from Teddy Roosevelt. And the glory belongs to those in the arena. Whether they win greatly or fail miserably, but they know the great effort and the great cause. I'm there. I think it's worth it. I didn't even get that heavy on that, but thank you for those first two questions. Now everybody else come up and top that.
I'll just add to that some examples of communities I've written about or I've visited recently that have used the education piece about the history of their own community. One example is Louisville, Kentucky. I was there last fall. They did a whole community education sort of campaign, a storyboard online, outlining the history of their community and all the policies that created their segregation of their neighborhoods, of their schools, all of the policies, described in color of law, but on the local level. And they took that around the community to educate people about, why their community looks the way it does. It's not an accident. It's not some act of God. It's not like, some magical occurrence. It was purposefully created that way. And then they used that to feed into a rezoning process, a citywide rezoning process, where people then had the understanding of, zoning created this. We can get out of it by making some changes, and they've changed a lot of their zoning to allow more dense housing in single-family only areas, and it's been a whole process. But there's many other communities that have done similar things, where by understanding the history and being aware of how intentionally it was created, the segregation of their communities, you can start to see that intentional action can undo it. Without that education, we're left, where we were with this de facto idea where, this thing, it just happened. There's nothing to be done. And so I think that education is an essential step.
Other questions?
Well, we had a question about when you mentioned when the GIs came home after World War II, and they had money for college, they had money for housing. Did the blacks? That's what I thought. But I thought it.
No, the GI Bill was pretty much. I think there's like a handful of African American veterans who got those benefits, but the loans through the Veterans Administration was just for whites.
Just for whites. And that's where education comes in. I mean, I think a lot of people have no idea about that, and it, right there is such an amazing wall for lack of wealth.
1.7 million African American veterans were denied education benefits after World War II. Just kind of process that number.
Hi, my name is Michaela Massey. I really enjoyed your presentation. I learned so much, and I really appreciated what you said about HB 551 and how even though you live in California, you made it real for us here in North Carolina. My question is a little bit different because I know you also mentioned how a lot of people have the perspective that this is because of de facto segregation, and how this isn't something that is necessarily a personal choice. And my whole life, I've grown up in diverse neighborhoods. And then recently, I would say like 5 years ago, my mom moved up in the world and now she can afford to live in the suburbs. We moved to the suburbs, this was actually during 2020, and we're the only Black family on that street. And I remember these two ladies were having a conversation about what the entire purpose of the Black Lives Matter protest was with George Floyd, and as soon as they saw us, they stopped talking. I was just outside playing with my sister. And so what I'm thinking about here is like, as we do move up, or as we do move into, I'm addressing middle-class Black families here. So as we do have these middle-class Black families that are moving into these neighborhoods that do have these resources, what safety measures can we implement for us in these places? And is that something that we've thought about, as there are people who are able to do this? And I know there's a lot of people that aren't, but for those that are kind of following this framework that you have set up.
I mean, I can speak to sort of answer your question in a slightly different way, and that is, I think white people in that community have an obligation to talk to each other and make sure that they are a welcoming community. And so the people here who live in those kinds of communities, we might not be the majority in every white suburb, but we can start to build that majority and ensure that that those communities are welcoming to African American families as they move in. Just to bring it back to real life examples, again, we wrote about 3 communities that did that in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, that started to diversify white suburban communities and didn't want to go the way of other suburbs, where when Blacks started moving in, all the whites left, and they lost their community and the community flipped. Often that was pushed by realtors through block budgeting and other policies and practices that sort of scared the white people to leave and then sold the houses for higher prices to the Blacks moving in. So these communities didn't want to do that, so they organized themselves. They organized around, a collective value of being inclusive and welcoming, and they created organizations and groups to introduce themselves to the people coming in and to create sort of cross-race relationships and institutions that could foster that kind of inclusivity and integration and ensure that their community could sustain an integration over time. And they've been successful. One of them, Oak Park, Illinois, outside of Chicago, they had several innovative policies to help try to incentivize and create this stable integration. One of them is still active. They have a the Oak Park Regional Housing Center, and they do, just as an example of sort of how policy can affect this. They do referrals, so people coming looking for housing in Oak Park can go to the housing center and get referred to places that have units available, and they do referrals based on what they think, because they know the communities and they know the buildings in that area, so they do referrals that will promote integration and not create segregated buildings or blocks within their small town. And landlords can participate in programs they have to, get financing to fix up their apartment buildings in return for taking the referrals or for waiting, keeping their apartment vacant until a referral comes along that would integrate their building. So this community has been, very committed to this. That's why I'm telling this example. They created a whole institution that's still going 30 years later to ensure that they maintain this integration. So I think there's, the piece of just living around each other is the first step, and then ensuring that creates positive relationships, and that's on all of us, yeah.
I would just add to that too, for people of color, Black folks specifically in a situation like that, living together in proximity, still maintain your own physical and psychological safety, but you're not the teacher de facto in those situations. It is not your responsibility to educate white people. There is white work that white people need to do. From the examples that Leah just gave, that is their responsibility. It is not on us in any situation that doesn't feel comfortable or weird to assume that role in the effort of trying to make harmony, because that puts a lot of pressure. psychologically, emotionally, to feel like you have to represent blackness or any other type of non-white ethnicity wherever you are. Maybe one or two more?
You guys are talking a lot.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed what you've shared. So I just had some thoughts just based off of my conversations with my wonderful classmate here. And just some, like your comment and just in totality. I believe that the change has to be unified, but I also believe that a lot of, if we look around the room right now and the people who are consuming this information, a small percentage are African American. And so I grapple with how do we activate or get people of color invested in systemic issues that impact them long term. Because like my classmate and I were speaking about, our parents sold us a formula, right? This is the formula of success. As an African American woman in this country, this is how you succeed. What they didn't incorporate in that formula were the variables of everything else that they could not see and they did not know. And so are there models, or do you know of models in the country where Black communities specifically, because I believe in order for it to really be like effective long-term and like really the ripple gets wide, we have to be invested in our change. And we don't consume this information. When you talk about community engagement, you rarely see large numbers of African Americans or people of color.
I wish I could remember the name of this effort, but there was an organization of African American pastors who united in Chicago and started to have those kinds of conversations of education I'm trying to think the specifics, but what struck me as you were talking and why I remembered it is it was beyond like we have to arm ourselves, not arm, that sounds like a very combative word, but making sure that we have our facts, have the facts, have the education piece and build from it. And that was part of this effort, was to just even get the pastors all on the same page, because some of them weren't so happy about, all coming together. There's some pastors like to have, power. But I go back to the ripple, every effort, it takes do something. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to even know all the questions. But part of the way things get better is not assuming it'll get better by somebody else. What can you do? How can you make it a little, can you go to lunch? Can you organize a lunch group just at your office or with the students, just to have once a conversation, just something. One of the things, the other thing I will share, I read Leah's book twice, just because I was nervous I was going to screw it up in front of the author. And I still have that, kind of fear of getting the F on the paper. But one of the things that struck me in the first part of the book, the way we have built our cities post-World War II, and it's not just, we segregate everything. I mean, yes, part of it was very intentional racial segregation, but it is so hard to meet your neighbors. You've got big ass lots, and sorry, that's a technical planning term. And we don't build sidewalks, and we don't make connections, and so we don't have things that help us meet our neighbors and create community. And so one of the things that the stories that in the first part of the book about the twin blocks, about how the neighborhoods come together and how they learn the 300 block of Elm versus South Elm versus North Elm, just as an illustration, and how they're different. But it struck me in reading the different stories is we have to be, things that used to happen in the neighborhood I grew up, because I grew up in just an older neighborhood that people walked to work, they walked to church, there was we walked to school. but we were in connection with each other. Well, because we don't have those things, we have to be deliberate and intentional about reconnecting with each other as community, because we have systematically built away those connections. We've stripped away those connections. So take a shot. Maybe somebody will say no, not today, but maybe they'll say yes next week. And you just, one at a time.
Yeah, and I'll add, every example we give in our book and in our Substack column where we're writing about this, we're very intentional in focusing on groups that are both white and black, leadership and membership. So, because it's on all of us to address this together. So all of the examples we give have, black leadership along with white leadership. So I don't have a specific example to answer your question exactly, but if you have it in you for one more story from the book, I'll expand on what Sue was referencing, which is the story from Chicago about the map twins. That's what this project was called. Actually, the Folded Map Project. It's an artist named Tanika Johnson. She's a photographer in Chicago, activist artist. So she took the unique layout of Chicago, which is laid out on a perfect grid. So the streets have a north side and a south side. The north side is mostly white, the south side is mostly African American. When you fold the map in half, the houses have the same numbers on the north and south side of the same street. And she called those houses map twins, the ones that sit perfectly on top of each other when she folded the map in half, and took pictures of the homes and showed them in an exhibit to show, the homes themselves aren't that different, but the context they exist in is very different because of the segregation of those areas. And then she went and knocked on the doors of the map twin houses and introduced herself and told them about her project, the people who lived there, and invited them to be involved. And to be involved, they agreed to meet their map twin and tour each other's neighborhoods. And these are people who, many of them had lived in Chicago their whole lives and had never been to the other side of town or known somebody who lived there. And they developed ongoing relationships. They're still in touch. They get together regularly. They learned that they had a lot in common. They had no idea about the other side of town and how different it was. And then they formed block twin groups. So whole blocks would get together and do supportive efforts. So this is an example of the intentional steps we might need to take to build these relationships, but that it's possible. This is sort of, the gimmick is the perfect grid map, but it doesn't have to take that. We give other examples from cities that don't have a perfect grid, and but they bring people together from segregated parts of town to just start building those relationships, and that's how, this has to begin, because none of us can do this on our own. Really, we have to do it together.
So that question was a great setup for our last section, which is the section on ACT. Set this up. Oh, what's going on? I don't want to sign into crime.
The people asked him, saying, "What shall we do then?"
What's that?
It's from Luke chapter 3, verse 10. What then must we do? Tolstoy asked the same question. He wrote a book with that title. He got so upset about the poverty in Moscow that he went one night into the poorest section and just gave away all his money. You could do that now. $5 American would be a fortune to one of these people.
Wouldn't do any good. Just be a drop in the ocean.
That's the same conclusion Tolstoy came to. I disagree.
No, what's your solution?
Well, I support the view that you just don't think about the major issues. You do whatever you can about the misery that's in front of you. Add your light to the sum of light. You think that's naive, don't you?
Yep.
It's all right, most journalists do.
We can't afford to get involved.
Typical journo's answer.
So I'm going to, on this last part, we want to pass out some index cards, and then this may take a few moments, but we'll see how quickly it can go. If you need a pen, raise your hand. We can pass some pens around. Thank you, Leah and Orpheus. So while the passing is going on, what I want you to do is on one side of the card, try your very best to write down 3 things based upon what you've heard tonight, both from our speakers and the people in the audience, that you could do about this particular systemic racist issue. Okay, based upon what you heard from Leah, Sue, and what you heard from yourselves this evening. We'll give you a few moments to do that. And then again, we're going to ask for anyone that would want to share one or more of their ideas of things that they think they could do.
I'm just going to share one of the points that I wrote on my card. Just in hearing Schwartz talk about the kind of ripple effect that she hopes to have in her personal conversations with people she interacts with, it's kind of what came out of our conversation when we had that group meetup. And it kind of hinged on what this young lady spoke about in terms of this lack of knowledge in our community. And, you know, I'm a first generation homeowner, so I was telling my partner how much it is 2 years into it, and I'm like, I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm still learning, but in as much as I learn about it, I make sure that I share that with my family and friends. So even though they're not here with me at this meeting, it's still kind of like my responsibility to pass that knowledge on to them when I get into these informal conversations with them. And part of the, I want to add that part of the reason that we don't have that representation in forums like this is because we have so many challenges against us, job-wise. As a grad student, I recognize the need to have balance in my life, and so when I'm not in front of the computer, I'm in the park or out doing something, and I'm recognizing there are only certain types of people who can afford to determine what their schedule is. And so it's not that we don't want to be here, but it's quite challenging. But for those who can make it, I urge you and I urge myself to have these conversations with other people, to pass that knowledge on, so that we could reformulate what that what a form of success is.
One I have down here, coffee and conversation. I heard that a lot, folks getting together for coffee just to bounce ideas. And I had a lot of interesting conversations just before coming in. And I always think that engaging in dialogue with people, especially those that look different from yourself, whatever that difference is, it's just good. It gives you a fresh perspective. It just opens up doors and moves beyond boundaries that you wouldn't even think are there, sometimes for self-imposed or otherwise. So coffee and conversation I have with somebody who does not look like me. And then the other thing that I have, just based off of some of the thoughts that were shared, is connecting with the younger African American generation and working towards change as African Americans. I was born in the 70s, so the younger ladies that spoke, you're my daughters. When I grew up on Section 8 in public housing, we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor. You know, a lot of the things that we talked about today, we just didn't know. You just kind of, it's your day-to-day, you do what you need to do, and then that's it. And it's only in hindsight that I can see some of these things as being inequitable. It's only in hindsight that I can see some of these things as being discriminatory. It's only in hindsight. But if you ask that same question to my kids and the younger ladies that spoke, their perspective would be different. They're now in a middle-class family. They now are sitting in spaces and places that I didn't have the opportunity to when I was growing up. So it would be nice to make that connection, and I think it's important that us as older somethings, more seasoned somethings, sit at the table with you younger folks so that we can work towards change. So I have that down as well.
So just adding on to that, adding the perspective of someone who's not that old. I'm saying young is I can see how that kind of sounds.
I understand, because I'm not that old either.
I had a lot of time to think about this. One thing that I can kind of do is temper my own thinking when it comes to how quickly these solutions can come about. Because when you're young and you first learn about a lot of these issues, they seem really pressing, because they are, but the sort of urgency to get something done about them can kind of become overwhelming. And you think that any kind of slow, local level change isn't somehow as valid as like grand sweeping federal level change. And that's something that I've had to kind of come to terms with, that in fact some of the biggest things are done at the smallest levels. So, yeah. And also just recalling this information whenever you're kind of faced with issues that are in this realm, and just remembering that education that you might have gotten and trying to expand it whenever you can.
Of course, I know 2 books you can buy. I think, Sue, too, I want to add one thing and throw one thing in that I thought when he was sitting there. One of my old bosses, by the way, I was in community planning for about 19 years and have been in transportation planning for about 12 or so. My boss used to always say that, Mark, in planning, you can't go home and go back and look at the results of your work that day. It takes 5 years. It takes 10 years for that subdivision or that development. Maybe I shouldn't use the word subdivision. That neighborhood to become what it is, or that development to become what it is. And so this is really difficult. Anybody else want to share one of their 3 things? Because now, what you're going to do is take your card, you're going to mark all 3 of those things off. You're going to just draw a line right through them. You're going to turn your card over, and you're going to write down what you are going to do. I'm not going to ask you to sign them and turn them in. But move through that thought process of this is what can be done to what I can do. I want to thank y'all for participating in the engagement portion of this evening. Thank you to Manu and Morpheus for helping lead that discussion. Like I say, I'm not going to ask you to say what you are going to do, but I want you to take that card and fold it up. And if you have a pocket near your heart, put it near your heart. If not, you may have to walk out like this on there. And truly think about what it is or how it is you can do that. Leah gave some very good examples of big picture things that can be done, but also very small picture things, whether it's talking to your elected official, coming out in support of certain types of things. So there are things that can be done. Give yourselves a round of applause. You have a lot of courage being here, not just because of the rain, but because this is very difficult work. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate everyone turning out and being here tonight. We do have, I say there are 3 other sessions. One is tomorrow night, and that is on environmental justice. And our speakers will be Jasmine Washington, who is an associate attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. They have an office over in Chapel Hill. They are national in terms of the work that they do. And then we will hear also from Omega and Brenda Wilson, who are the co-founders of the West End Revitalization Association. They are over in Mebane, and they do the good work of fighting highways and landfills and helping communities of color stand up to some of the actions that we take as local and state and national governments when it comes to environmental issues and the siting of landfills and things of that nature. And then we'll take a little bit of hiatus and come back in May. So I hope you don't mind that we have your email addresses, and we'll keep you informed of those two other events. Some of you have managed to purchase tickets to Eventbrite, even though I didn't think I had activated them. But that's fine. We're going to activate those towards the end of April. Right now, those two are scheduled to be over at the Magnolia House. Anybody familiar with the Magnolia House? Okay, it's right in downtown Greensboro. But you know, keep your eyes open for details related to those. We'll continue the Social Justice Bazaar as you leave and exit, and hope that you have a chance for conversation. Again, if you've bought the book, Leah is here to sign that. There's nothing better than having a signed book by the author. Believe me, there really is nothing. And you can also get copies of the book. So thank you all very much from the bottom of my heart for being here. And thank you.